In this screenshot, you can see the file manager from cPanel, the control panel for my domain. You can see the directories, shown with the little folder icons, and the files with varying icons depending on the file contents. If you look at the right hand side of the screen, there's a column of numbers. These indicate the permissions that each of the directories and files have been assigned. But what do they mean? Well, to understand permissions, we first need to understand a little bit about who is likely to be accessing our files and folders. And this is really split into three distinct areas. There's the user. This is just an account that can access the computer. Now, generally, a user will be the same as a person. In other words, you as an individual may have a user account, but it isn't always a person, as for example, the web server may also have a user account. There's a group. This is just a way of categorizing multiple users so they can be organized more easily. And anybody who isn't either the owner or a member of the group can be thought of as others or rest of the world. A few things to bear in mind. A user who owns a file would normally have complete control over it. The user would say what the other members of the group he was in would be allowed to do with the file, and the user would determine what, if anything, people outside his group could do with the file. So those numbers we saw, let's take a look at what those actually mean. Using cPanel, if I wanted to change the permissions for a specific directory or file, then I would right-click on that item and choose Change Permissions from the pop-up menu, which would bring up the box you can see here. I could also have just clicked on the current permissions number and typed in a new number, but the pop-up makes it easier to see who you're giving permissions to and what level of access you're permitting. So how does this work? Well, here's the key to understanding it. Look down the user column and you'll see the user is allowed read and write access, but not execute access to that file that we're changing the permissions on. So if read access equals 4 and write access equals 2, we add the two numbers together, which gives us 6. So moving on to group, again the group has been given read permission, but this time it's not got write permission or execute permission. So looking at our key, read equals 4. That's all it's got. So the first number's 6, the second number's 4. Looking at the column for others or world, again we've granted read permission to that file, but we're not going to let anybody write to it and we're not going to let anybody execute it. So read has got 4 and that's all it's got on that column. So for that particular file we end up with a permission number of 644. Here are some important points to remember when assigning permissions to directories and files. Read permission. That grants permission to read the contents of a file. But when you assign read permission for a directory, it only gives permission to read the names of the files and nothing else. With write access, it grants permission to change the contents of a file, but when write permission is given to a directory, it means the user can create or delete a file in that directory. Execute access, that gives permission to execute a file, which basically means that you can run the program or script. But when execute permission is set against a folder, it means you can access the contents of the directory, but you can't list the files that are in there unless you also have read access to the directory. It's worth remembering that permissions assigned to a directory are not inherited by the files within that directory. So you clearly have to give quite a bit of thought as to what levels of access you're going to give to files and folders, the impact your decisions will have, and whether they're too restrictive or secure enough. Thankfully, the makers of WordPress have made life easy and given us some guidance. So here's what WordPress.org recommend. All directories should be 755 or 750. All files should be 644 or 640, except for wp-config.php, which should be 440 or 400. And one last thing, never give any directory permissions of 777. And the reason for that is that you're basically letting anybody get read, write and execute access to that directory. And from a security point of view, that's the most dangerous thing you can do.